Today I want to talk about the Polar Vantage V version 2. 7.09 miles, 8 minutes, 20 seconds per mile, 144 beats per minute today, going for a run with the Polar Vantage version 2. Pretty excited to tell you guys about this watch, but before I do want to go over some disclosures. This is a watch that was sent to me from Polar for the purpose of review, so I didn't have to pay for it. However, they're not paying me to make this video or to use this watch, and they're not going to get a chance to preview any of my footage or my thoughts before this video goes up on YouTube. I'm also going to be talking about a lot of other reference devices today, but so the disclosures doesn't get too long, I'll tell you guys more about that in the description down below, which ones were purchased by me, which ones were sent to me, so that you guys can know that. So with the disclosures out of the way, let's talk about the Polar Vantage V2. Now, the Polar Vantage V2 is an update to the Vantage version 1, which was released, I believe, in 2018. We also saw the Grit X, which is a watch that has been my preferred daily driver in terms of watch. Now, with the Grit X, we saw brand new features within the watch like Hill Splitter, which lets you see on your watch the incline of the hill, how long the hill is, and creates automatic splits for you when you go back to look at your data so that you could see like how long was each climb or how long was each descent and what were your different statistics like your pace and your power output through both of those settings. That feature comes to the Vantage V2, as does the compass, which enables commute route navigation. That also comes to the Vantage V2 as well. And you're also going to get that data screen, which shows you the weather and the weather forecast. The watch pulls that data from your phone, and then you're able to get a screen that shows you the next several hours in terms of what the weather forecast is going to be. That comes to the Vantage V2 as well. So 3 really great features from the Grit X that I use regularly are now on the Vantage V2. Now for some things that are brand new to the Vantage V2 are some more data features that I think that I'm going to be looking at very regularly. One is there's a new data screen called This Week, and previously you've been able to see things like what your sleep tracking has been like and what your overall training is like. Are you maintaining, are you detraining, or you're overtraining? Now there's a new screen that tells you what your activity has been like this week. It tells you what your overall training time has been for the week, and it gives you in our little ring around the watch different color codes that indicates how much time you've spent in each zone. So if you're 80-20 training, you can get a look at it at a glance really quick as to how you've been doing. So that's something for me as someone that likes to focus on number of hours trained per week and overall mileage per week. And I also generally like to keep track of how much intensity I have, how much time I'm spending in zone 1, zone 2, and how much time am I spending in more intense periods of activity. This is a data screen that I'm going to be looking at all the time. The other thing that I really like, which seems kind of trivial, but like it's been really useful for me already in just the handful of days that I've had this watch so far, is now there's music controls right on the watch. You've got 5 glorious buttons on this watch that I'm really enjoying. And now you can click down to another screen while you're in your activity, like when you're running or you're cycling. And there you can either advance a track or wind a track, pause and change volume, all with buttons. Now this screen is a nice touch screen, but I rarely use the touch screen if I don't have to. I much prefer to use buttons. And now with it being fall, we're getting temperatures that are dropping. I'm running in gloves more often than not these days. And before long, it's going to be winter time where I'm running in mittens. So being able to change volume with buttons is something that I'm really looking forward to. I'm very glad to see this feature on the watch. It still doesn't store any music on the watch, which is something that I would have really liked to have seen in a Polar watch, but I don't think any Polar watches do that. But the next best thing is that you can control your music now from the watch, which I find really helpful. I've done it while running, and I've also done it while on the bike. Much easier than trying to like reach for wherever my phone is. So I've been really enjoying this feature. Two other really new notable things for the Vantage V2 is that it's much lighter than the Vantage version 1. Now the Vantage version 1 is probably the heaviest running watch that I've ever tested. I've tested a bunch of them and most of them pale in comparison to the Vantage version 1. The Grit X got a lot lighter than the Vantage version 1, and the Vantage version 2 comes in at 52 grams, so it's a much lighter in terms of weight compared to the Vantage version 1. Really happy to see that. Although I didn't mind the heaviness of the watch, it actually felt kind of like substantial. It made it feel a little bit more premium to have it really heavy. There are times when you're trying to pick up the pace where having like that a heavy watch just feels a little bit awkward sometimes. And so this watch at 52 grams feels like the right weight. The great thing about it is there's still a really great battery life in it though, even though it's a lot lighter. This year, they're saying that you're going to get 40 hours of activity time. What I've seen so far is I've done 4.5 hours just about of GPS tracking, running and cycling over the course of 3 days of wearing it constantly, fiddling around with it, customizing it to how I want it to look and just playing around with it 3 days. I still have 30% battery life left. So I'm hoping that I'll get like about 5 days in between charges, or the way that I kind of like to see it is if I'm going to go on a long weekend adventure, I won't have to worry about bringing the charger. Now, one of the things that Polar has been kind of pivoting towards in its watches the past couple of years is that it really wants to focus not just on like capturing data in terms of like how hard were you running, how fast were you running, what was your GPS tracing. I mean, it does all that. It does all of those things really well. But another aspect of what the Polar watch wants to bring to you is an ability for you to understand like how your body is really responding to all that training and how ready are you as an athlete to be able to perform on any given day. And so some of the stuff that I've seen in the Vantage version 1 that still carries through it, and I'm very happy to see in the version 2 of the Vantage, is great things like the sleep tracking. Not only does it tell you like how long you slept and were there any interruptions, but it gives you deep sleep, REM sleep. It gives you your heart rate variability, your breathing rate, so lots of great data. And then on top of that, it gives you an assessment of how good your sleep really was. So that way you're not just looking at numbers and saying like, well, yeah, I'm better than I was like a couple of days ago. It gives you an assessment of whether your sleep was compromised or whether your sleep was okay or whether it was good. So that's something that I look at every day. And I'm very glad to see that it's still here on this watch. The other thing that sleep data wraps into is the Training Pro, which gives you an idea. It takes the data from your training, your heart rate, your distance and your paces, and it puts it in with your sleep training data. And it gives you kind of like a training evaluation. Are you detraining? Are you maintaining your level of fitness? Are you overtraining? So I like having that as well. I look at that in conjunction with the sleep training just to kind of get a feel for like, if I'm not sure, do I want to go on a really long run this Saturday or just do I need to tone it down a little bit? That helps me kind of make some of those decisions as well. I also just kind of enjoy when I feel like I'm working hard to see that kind of validation, to see like that ticker going up, to say that, to show that it can recognize with my body's metrics that my body is feeling the strain from those activities, and hopefully it's going to be improving. On top of that, there are more diagnostics that again push Polar even further in the direction of not only capturing your data, but also helping guide your future activity and your future training. Two new things that I think are going to be pretty interesting to test. there's going to be run testing, which I think is be really interesting, which I think they're going to have you run at a couple of different paces. It's all guided by the watch. And from that, they're going to look at your pace and your power, because you could get power from the wrist on this watch. And you're also going to be looking at your heart rate. And then from there, it's going to giving you assessments and pre-populating all of your different zones. So whether you want to train by power, you want to train by heart rate, or you want to train by pace, it can pre-populate all those different zones for you based on how you do on the run test, which I think is pretty cool. Previously, I think that there were some defaults that I never really thought were the most applicable to me, and I always found that I had to constantly change them. So having a way that it can kind of auto-populate, I think will be really interesting. Stay tuned for that. I'm definitely going to be testing out that feature soon. The other feature that I think is going to be pretty interesting, I'm super curious about this one, is there's a leg recovery test. The watch beeps at you and you jump. You put your hands on your hips and you just jump as high as you can. You land back down, you wait for it to beep again, and you jump, and you do that a total of 3 times. And without any other equipment, just from all the sensors that are on this watch, it's able to tell you like how fresh are your legs. So if you're thinking about whether or not you're going to do that hard workout today, or maybe you need another rest day and you can move it to tomorrow, that's going to be able to tell you how to do that. You need to do the test 3 times over the course of 28 days. I've not had it long enough to be able to do enough testing. So that's definitely something that'll be coming up in the future. I did my first test today. Felt really weird to be doing that. The neighbor next door was like outside and kind of saw me doing it, and I'm sure he was pretty confused. So lots of great features that are new to the Vantage V2 that I think are pretty exciting, but it's not going to really matter if the data it captures isn't accurate. So let's take a look at that. So what I've done here is I've loaded up data from the Grit X, which was using the Polar OH1 armband external heart rate monitor. I always have a hard time with any wrist-based heart rate monitor, no matter which watch, no matter which brand. They all kind of give me problems. I can't get an accurate reading, so I always use an external monitor. And I had the Grit X also paired to my Stride FootPod, so my pace and distance data were coming from the FootPod. Compare that against the Vantage V2, which was just by itself. So we're going to see kind of like that wonky heart rate. You'll see a little bit of that. You'll get a chance to check out the wrist-based power, and you'll get to see a chance to see its GPS. Although from the Grit X, you're also going to, as far as the GPS tracing goes, that's going to be coming from the watch as well. So let's take a look at it. Load it up in DC Rainmaker's analyzer tool. The first thing you're going to see is power, and it looks kind of weird at the beginning. And what happened here is there's a couple of minutes where the power just goes really crazy. I would forgive you for thinking that, I must have had to take a bathroom break here. That wasn't exactly the case. I left the house today without an SD card in my GoPro. So I had to turn around and get it. So that little break in the power there is from when I came back in the house to get that SD card. But what you could see is pretty normal, what I would expect when I'm comparing a Stride FootPod power number from Polar's wrist-based power. If you could see, like, the peaks and valleys are all kind of in the same place. They're just off. They're like just transposed by a certain number, and it stays relatively constant. What's a little bit surprising to me is that it seems like the Vantage V, the power numbers, like the peaks are higher and the valleys are lower. So there's a wider like range of power numbers, but generally like both are kind of like dovetailing pretty nicely. And so I feel like that's pretty consistent with what I've seen in terms of the power numbers. The power numbers from Polar are always higher by like a certain amount than the power numbers from a Stride FootPod. Next, let's take a look at the heart rate. As far as the heart rate goes, I was actually a little bit surprised by this one. Again, remember there's like that wonky area in the beginning where I had to come back in the house for the SD card. But for the most part, I'm pretty surprised at how well the Vantage V version 2 did as far as tracking my heart rate. Now, there were a couple of times where it had a hard time. Today's workout was 20 minutes warm up, 20 minutes at right around like marathon effort, and then 30 minutes of cool down. Or that was a scheduled run. I cut it a little bit short due to time today. And so one of the things you could see is that the OH1, the armband heart rate monitor, picks up pretty accurately where I've like kind of picked it up a little bit, and it gives me a little bit of a more sustained heart rate, which is right in my marathon kind of pace range. The Vantage V actually gave me a lower reading for a lot of that time, and so it was quite a bit off. And then towards the end, it just spiked. And after it spiked, I did notice it when it was up like way high up here, and I rearranged it a couple times. And that's something I did maybe 3 or 4 times. I had to keep like fidgeting with it, which is one of the things that always happens with me in wrist-based heart rate monitors. I'm always trying to fidget with it to get it in the right spot to get an accurate reading. And once I did that, it came back down again, although then I think it was lower than what my actual heart rate was. So it's not perfect. It's not as reliable as an external heart rate monitor, but I still think it did a pretty good job, especially towards the end here as I'm cooling down. It's pretty much spot on with what the armband is doing. In the beginning, it's kind of close, but it's still kind of underreporting just a little bit. So still, I would want to pair this with an external heart rate monitor, but that's just might be something with me and kind of my anatomy. Here we're taking a look at the cadence. We're talking the cadence that's coming from the stride foot pod and the cadence that's coming from the wrist measurement. And they're pretty close. For the most part, they're off by like anywhere between 1 to 3 strides per minute. Although the way that Polar does it, it only captures or only counts like every other foot. So it's off by like 2 to 6 strides per minute is generally what I'm seeing. There's a couple of weird dips down here, and I'm not sure if that corresponds to when I was like fidgeting with the watch. So that's might be what's going on there. As far as distance goes, the distance is coming from the grit. It's coming from the stride foot pod. And the distance from the Vantage V version 2 is coming from GPS, and they're pretty much spot on. They're exactly the same. So I'm pretty impressed with that. Next, we'll take a look at elevation. And elevation, they're pretty much the same graph, but transposed for a reason. They're off by about like 6 meters here from what I could see on the graph. And I'm not exactly sure what it is. Each of these watches has a barometric altimeter in it. And so they're taking their own readings of what the altitude is. And so I ultimately don't really care because I'm not trying to set records in terms of how high I'm climbing. What I care about is like if I run up a hill that is a certain number of feet tall, or if I run down a hill that is a certain number of feet in descent, is it accurately capturing the delta? And for both of these watches, it looks like that they are. They're just off, relative to each other. So I'm not too concerned about that. Next graph here is the mean max power. That's going to be off because of the fact that the Polar numbers are always higher than the stride numbers. And then let's take a look at the GPS. Last time I did a video, I was looking at Coros watch, and a couple of you guys mentioned that I really need to be looking at this from satellite view rather than from map view, so we could take a look at that. And here you could see kind of like this is the area over here. Let's scroll back over where I have to loop back around. Because I forgot that SD card, and so I did that. But generally what I'm finding is that both of these watches are doing a pretty good job of capturing what's going on here. I'm usually running either on this dirt road, I usually run in the middle, or lately I've been running on the right-hand side of the road. And so I'm actually not sure which one of these is the correct one. And this is actually correct here because I did hook to the left side of the road so I could get some camera footage of that creek that's over there. So that's accurate. And so the one that's lower, that tracing is the one that's probably most accurate because I got like right up to the edge. And then I came back to the other side of the street, and then let's hurry up and get over towards the area where I'm making the turn, because that's where I'm noticing some of the biggest differences, because for the most part this is pretty much what the tracing looks like throughout the entire route. But when I get closer to the turns, it looks like it's doing kind of like some weird stuff. I'm not really sure what's going on here. I don't think that this is accurate for what I did, either of these two. Now I think that what I did do is eventually I cut across kind of like the street. I was in the middle of it for a little while. It's a country road. It's not that busy. And then I eventually hit the right-hand side of the street, and then later cut back over as I was turning back onto 163rd. So I think that this darker line is doing the better job here in this instance in capturing it. And then I was on the right-hand side of the street today. And so again, the darker line is doing better. We can see that as we're going around the road, it's, I think, capturing it pretty nicely. This lighter line isn't doing quite as good of a job in terms of capturing where I actually ran on this particular day. One of the things that I do note though is anytime there's a turn, if it's a wide turn like this curve in the road, it tends to capture pretty accurately what I was doing. But whenever there's a tighter turn, that's when it tends to kind of like get a little bit confused and is not really sure what I'm doing. I went on a bike ride that had a lot more turns in it, and I noticed kind of the same thing. Even when I would have like hugged kind of like the right-hand side or like that solid white line on the right-hand side of the road, it kind of had me like swooping around sometimes on both watches. So I just don't know if that's actually what the GPS watches are capturing or if that's just some of the smoothing that the Polar like tracing algorithm is doing. I'm not sure which one is really the case there. But in either event, both of these tracings are pretty accurate and I think are giving me some pretty good overall readings. So overall, pretty impressed. They made the watch smaller, not in terms of like the watch face, but it's not as thick. It's a lot lighter than it was in version 1, but it doesn't seem to have affected the GPS accuracy. And I think that although sometimes it's overestimating and sometimes it's underestimating, I think that as far as trying to get a wrist-based heart rate, for me, it's doing a better job than a lot of other watches that I've run with, even from Polar, in the past couple of years. So pretty impressed with that as well. Now let's talk about pricing. The Vantage V2 is one of Polar's flagship watches. It comes in at $500 US. There's a bundle where you can get this, and I believe it's the Polar H10 heart rate monitor for $550, which I think is a pretty good deal in terms of the savings that you get buying that heart rate monitor. It's a pretty expensive heart rate monitor, but in either event, that's a lot of money to pay for a running watch. There are times where I'm not so sure that me as a guy that primarily runs roads is really getting the full benefit of a watch this robust. There are tons of features available for swimmers, cyclists, and multi-sport athletes, as well as different profiles for a whole other host of activities that you can use. As someone who mostly runs, occasionally bikes, it sometimes feels like it's a little bit more watch than I need. But on the other hand, I really do like having the barometric altimeter because I want to get that hill splitter data. I want to know how I'm doing on specific hills, and having the actual measurement coming from the watch, I think, is way more precise than the other way that watches will get altitude data, which is will kind of like extrapolate it from your GPS locations. I also like to be able to have the route navigation, and I really like being able to have all these different diagnostic tools to kind of give me a sense of like how my body's holding up as I get deeper and deeper into a training plan. So it's a little bit expensive, but it's the kind of data that I want, and it's the kind of data, the way that it's all packaged together with the Flow ecosystem, that I feel like is giving me a fully rounded picture of really what's happening. And that's something that I really value even as a non-elite athlete. So those are my thoughts of the Polar Vantage V2. Hit that subscribe button so you could see the leg test as well as the running test. Those videos will be coming up as well. If you have any questions about the Vantage V2, feel free to put them in the comments down below. Or better yet, I do a live stream every day, 3 p.m. Central Time. You can come by and ask any kinds of questions that you want there and just hang out with a whole bunch of other runners. Hopefully I'll see you there. That's all I have for today, everybody. Thanks so much for making it all the way to the end of this video. Hopefully you guys are staying safe out there on your runs, and I'll see you guys in the next one.
Yo, what's going on?